Middleton awoke slowly beneath a veil of fog that rolled off the harbor in gentle, ghostly waves. The gray light of dawn touched the water with trembling reflections, and the city seemed suspended between the waking world and a dream of itself. Along the cobblestone streets, slick with rain and morning dew, the clatter of wooden wheels echoed in irregular rhythms. Merchants and laborers hurried along the sidewalks, their faces pale, their eyes darting with habitual suspicion. Middleton had long harbored secrets, and the mist that clung to its streets this morning seemed almost a living presence, whispering them to anyone who would listen. Elizabeth Harrison moved among the townsfolk with careful determination. Her skirt swished against the damp stones, and each step carried a mixture of grace and unspoken tension. She was no stranger to propriety, yet this city, with its narrow alleys and distant chimneys, never afforded her a sense of peace. Today, however, a peculiar pull compelled her toward the orphanage on the edge of the wealthy quarter. She could not name the reason, only feel it pressing against the boundaries of her mind, insistent and chilling. The orphanage loomed at the juncture between opulent townhouses and crumbling warehouses. Its brick walls were mottled with age, and the barred windows cast long skeletal shadows along the ground. The gate, heavy and wrought of iron, protested with a prolonged groan as Elizabeth pushed it open. A blend of scents greeted her, a faint trace of children's soap, damp wood, wax polish, and an underlying mustiness that seemed to seep from the very walls. The air clung to her skin, cold and slightly sharp, and a flutter of unease settled in her chest. Inside, the orphanage was a study in contrasts. Light from tall windows fell unevenly across worn floors, revealing children seated with unnerving stillness. Their eyes, large and somber, followed Elizabeth's every move, and the quiet that blanketed the halls was punctuated only by the soft scraping of shoes and occasional whispered directions from caretakers. The building seemed to breathe around her, each corridor stretching longer than it should, shadows curling in corners where no light reached. And then she saw him. A boy stood by a window, leaning lightly against the sill. Sunlight caught in his hair, revealing golden-brown curls that glimmered like threads of spun sun. His eyes, startlingly clear and blue, seemed to pierce the dim interior, unafraid and unguarded. His features were symmetrical, almost unnervingly perfect, and Elizabeth felt an icy thrill wash over her, mingling admiration with a forbidden longing. Her son, frail and pale at home, could never have possessed such vitality, such unassailable beauty. And yet here, before her eyes, was a child who embodied everything she had quietly, selfishly desired. Double quotes, Mrs. Harrison, whispered a soft, careful voice behind her. One of the caretakers, a thin woman with faded eyes and a patient, worn face, approached. "This is James. He's been with us for 3 years. Quiet, but observant. Sometimes he notices more than he should." Elizabeth's gaze lingered on the boy. She saw the subtle tilt of his head, the way his shoulders carried a quiet dignity unusual for a child of his age. She imagined him at her own dining table, the sunlight catching his curls just so, servants attending to his every need, society whispering in admiration at her discernment. A thrill of ambition surged within her, laced with a deeper, darker curiosity. Could she possess this child, claim him as her own, and sweep away the shortcomings of her own son? The caretaker's words were soft, almost reverent. "He is careful with strangers. Yet there is intelligence there, and an intuition that is almost unsettling. Be mindful." Elizabeth smiled faintly, though it was a smile devoid of warmth. "I am careful," she replied, though her voice betrayed nothing of the turbulence within. She could feel a subtle, insistent heartbeat of possibility, as though the walls themselves were pressing the notion forward. Middleton, she realized, held its breath with her, aware, somehow, That something irrevocable was stirring. The children moved quietly, performing small mechanical tasks, sweeping, folding linen, sorting clothes. Their faces were pale, and many bore faint scars or bruises from the strict regimen of the institution. Elizabeth noticed how their eyes flitted toward James, occasionally, as though recognizing something extraordinary about him. She saw him stand apart, not in arrogance, but in an awareness that unsettled her. Even in this dim, regulated room, he seemed luminous, almost otherworldly. A distant bell tolled, echoing through the fog-wrapped streets outside, hollow and resonant. It sounded a warning she did not yet understand, a prelude to events that would spiral beyond her careful control. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. She began to imagine the exchanges, the arrangements, the subtle manipulations necessary to bring James into her life permanently. Each thought, each image, felt both natural and monstrous. A whisper of movement drew her attention. In the corner of the hall, a younger boy trailed his fingers along the wall, his eyes wide with curiosity and something darker fear, perhaps, or a prescience beyond his years. The shadow of a rat scuttled across the floor, unnoticed, yet its presence heightened the strange, electric tension in the air. Elizabeth felt a shiver run through her. It was as though the orphanage itself was alive, watching, waiting to see which path she would take. James shifted his gaze toward her, a subtle, knowing glimmer in his eyes. It was a look that hinted at comprehension, at the recognition of intentions unspoken. Elizabeth's chest tightened. She sensed, with a mingling of dread and exhilaration, that the boy understood far more than he should. And yet, she could not tear her eyes away. The corridors seemed to elongate, walls bending in the dim light, shadows deepening with every step she took. A soft hum, perhaps a child's song, or a whisper of air through the cracks in the old bricks, wove itself into the room's stillness, a spectral accompaniment to her growing obsession. Elizabeth's thoughts became a tangle of desire and fear, each feeding the other, spiraling toward a choice she could scarcely admit to herself. She turned to leave, only to catch a fleeting reflection in the polished floor. The eyes of the children, the tilt of James's head, the shadowed corners that seemed to twitch and breathe. In that instant, a sense of inevitability gripped her. Something had begun, something that could not be undone. Middleton, shrouded in fog and harbor mists, seemed to lean closer, a silent witness to the first step of a path both alluring and terrifying. Elizabeth walked back toward the entrance, her mind racing with plans, doubts, and forbidden desires. The city outside, gray and mist-wrapped, waited silently, as if the very air acknowledged that a secret, dark and potent, had been conceived within the walls of the orphanage. And in that quiet, shadowed hall, the first stirrings of a dangerous ambition had taken root, ready to grow into a storm that would consume everything in its path. The days that followed Elizabeth's first visit to the orphanage were consumed by a restless obsession. Middleton, with its fog-bound streets and uneven cobblestones, seemed to echo her inner turmoil. Every corner she turned, every market stall, every glimmering reflection in the river water reminded her of the boy James and the impossible longing he had stirred within her. She wandered the city in a haze, her thoughts twisting around one forbidden idea, one audacious, terrible possibility, that she might claim this child as her own dot at home. Her own son, sickly and pale, clung to life with a fragile persistence. She observed him from a distance, noting his weakness, the delicate curve of his bones beneath thin skin, the timid hesitations that betrayed his fragile constitution. In contrast, James had moved through the orphanage with a strength, a presence, and an intelligence that seemed almost unnatural in its perfection. Elizabeth's mind, torn between guilt and desire, began to sketch a plan, a dangerous, illicit, yet tantalizingly plausible design. Her days became a careful choreography of observation and planning. She visited the orphanage repeatedly, always under the guise of charity or social interest. Each visit allowed her to note the routines of the caretakers, the timing of meals, the brief moments when James would be left unattended, or when a single door might remain ajar. Elizabeth's heart raced with every detail recorded, every opportunity measured. The city itself, with its fog-wrapped alleys and echoing footsteps, seemed to conspire with her thoughts, urging her forward along a path she dared not yet acknowledge. A loud dot one afternoon, as the sun struggled to pierce the dense gray clouds, Elizabeth lingered longer than usual. She walked past the courtyard where children played under watchful eyes, observing James from a discreet distance. He moved differently from the others, his every gesture precise and deliberate, yet imbued with a quiet energy. He noticed her at once, his gaze catching hers, and a subtle tension shivered through the air between them. It was a look that unsettled Elizabeth, as if the child sensed more than he should, as if he could see into the recesses of her ambition and her moral uncertainty. Returning home, Elizabeth's thoughts were a tangle of fear, excitement, and rationalization. She told herself she would act only in the interest of her family, to bring vitality and promise into her household. Yet she knew, deep within, that the truth was far darker. The act she contemplated was one of selfishness, of aesthetic desire, of a craving for perfection that defied both conscience and law. The city around her seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her obsession. The streets of Middleton were filled with the distant clamor of the harbor, ships creaking against their moorings, sailors calling out orders, and the faint mournful toll of bells that marked the passage of hours. At night, the fog thickened, curling around lampposts and railings, wrapping the town in a suffocating embrace. Elizabeth would sit by her parlor window, watching shadows twist along the walls of neighboring houses, imagining the moment when her plan would unfold, and feeling a thrill laced with terror at the thought of crossing the threshold into irreversible action. Her first tangible step came one evening, when she arranged a private meeting with a caretaker, a woman of subdued demeanor and cautious speech. Elizabeth invited her to tea under the pretense of discussing charitable donations, but her mind already traced the contours of a more sinister negotiation. She spoke gently, weaving subtle flattery and concern, testing the waters for what she wished to achieve. The caretaker listened, alert but polite, unaware that beneath Elizabeth's composed exterior lay a storm of ambition and moral corruption. Over the following weeks, Elizabeth's planning became more audacious. She began to take note of the orphanage's routines with meticulous care, the times when children were bathed, the intervals during which doors were unlocked, the shifting patterns of the staff's attention. Each detail was stored in her memory like a precious, dangerous jewel. Middleton, in its foggy persistence, seemed to bend around her purpose, the streets whispering in the wind, shadows elongating to conceal her furtive movements. James, meanwhile, remained an enigma. His bright eyes, his careful observation of the world, his subtle awareness of the adults around him, all suggested an intelligence and intuition beyond his years. Elizabeth observed him with a mixture of awe and unease. There were moments when he would pause, glance toward her with a knowing expression, and smile faintly as if in silent acknowledgment of thoughts unspoken. In those moments, the thrill of her plan mingled with a creeping fear that James might perceive the dangerous intent that simmered in her mind. One evening, as twilight settled over Middleton, Elizabeth walked past the harbor. The fog hung thick and cold, muffling the clamor of ships and the cries of dock workers. She paused near the edge of the water, staring at the ripples that reflected the dying light. The city seemed quiet now, almost conspiratorial, as if it waited for her next move. Her reflection in the water, a pale, determined face with eyes alight with obsession, looked back at her. A silent reminder of the dangerous path she had begun in her heart. Elizabeth knew the first step had to be taken soon. The act itself removing one child, claiming another, was unthinkable in its audacity. Yet it called to her with a force she could neither resist nor entirely comprehend. Middleton, the orphanage, James himself, they all seemed to conspire toward a moment when choice would become action, and when desire, ambition, and fear would collide in irrevocable consequence. And in that heavy, fog-laden evening, Elizabeth felt the first true weight of what she was about to undertake. The city, alive with secrets and shadows, waited. The orphanage, silent and watchful, held its breath. And James, unaware of the web beginning to enclose him, moved through his world. With the unbroken, luminous presence that had captured Elizabeth's imagination and would soon test the limits of her morality. The morning fog lay heavier than usual over Middleton, curling through the narrow streets and muffling the sound of the harbor. Elizabeth awoke before dawn, her mind alight with a mixture of fear, excitement, and relentless determination. Today, the plan she had so meticulously cultivated would either succeed or unravel in ways she could not yet foresee. She dressed with trembling hands, the fine fabrics of her gown brushing against her skin like a whisper of the transgression to come. Every motion felt both natural and preposterous, a dangerous dance along the edge of propriety and law. At the orphanage, James moved among the other children with his usual quiet poise, unaware of the attention he had garnered in the weeks leading to this day. Elizabeth arrived just as the first bell tolled, signaling breakfast, her heart hammering against her ribs. The caretaker greeted her politely, yet with a subtle wariness that Elizabeth barely concealed under a veneer of courtesy. The air within the building seemed charged, thick with the scent of wood, dust, and the faint trace of so many children's lives pressed into the walls. Elizabeth followed James's routine with precise attention. She noted the brief moments when he would be slightly apart from the others, the times when doors were momentarily unguarded. Each second was a measured opportunity, a window that could vanish in an instant. Her mind rehearsed every detail of the exchange, imagining the child slipping from one life into another, the quiet sealing of a secret that would define the rest of their existence. When the moment arrived, it was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. James had wandered to the courtyard, distracted by a small bird that had taken shelter near the gate. Elizabeth, her pulse quickened, approached him with a gentleness that belied the storm within her. She spoke softly, her voice a mixture of warmth and command, and James turned his clear blue eyes upon her, attentive yet unafraid. The exchange was swift, almost surreal. A momentary lapse by the caretaker, an unexpected phone of distraction, a slip of attention, was all Elizabeth required. In the shadows of the courtyard, she guided James, careful not to startle him, and with a few whispered instructions, led him toward the waiting carriage. Each step reverberated in her mind, a hammering echo of inevitability. Inside the carriage, the boy was silent, observing Elizabeth with a clarity that both thrilled and unnerved her. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing upon her like a tangible thing, yet she continued, driven by a mixture of desire, ambition, and fear. Middleton's streets passed in a blur beneath the wheels, fog curling like ghostly fingers along the sides of buildings, whispering reminders of the moral precipice upon which she now teetered. The ride home was heavy with tension. James said nothing, but his eyes followed her constantly, intelligent and perceptive. Elizabeth, conscious of every glance, felt both pride and unease. This child, she realized, was no mere acquisition. He was an active participant in the unfolding drama, aware in ways she could scarcely admit. Every turn of the carriage, Every shadow that passed across the fog-laden streets seemed to carry a warning. She could not entirely ignore Dot at her house. Elizabeth's servants reacted with surprise and curiosity at the new arrival, yet the careful manner in which she presented James, calm, composed, almost maternal, ensured no immediate questions were asked. The boy moved through the rooms with the same quiet dignity he had displayed at the orphanage, noting everything, absorbing the subtle dynamics of the household. Elizabeth watched him, a strange mixture of triumph and unease coiling within her. As the day wore on, the initial thrill of success began to mingle with a creeping tension. James's awareness of his surroundings was unnerving. He observed details others overlooked, and his calm, deliberate manner suggested an understanding beyond his years. Elizabeth found herself constantly questioning her own actions, her conscience whispering warnings that she struggled to silence. Middleton, ever watchful, seemed to lean closer through the fog, as if acknowledging the gravity of the act she had committed and the web of consequences now set in motion. That evening, as the household settled, Elizabeth lingered near the boy, attempting to engage him in conversation, to measure his reactions, to gauge the depth of his awareness. James responded with politeness and careful words, but there was a subtle defiance in his gaze, an unmistakable intelligence that both fascinated and terrified her. She realized, with an uneasy thrill, that her moral transgression had not gone unnoticed, at least not entirely. The shadows lengthened, and the house took on an oppressive, almost suffocating stillness. Elizabeth moved from room to room, checking and rechecking, ensuring that nothing betrayed the secret she had wrought. Yet with each passing hour, the weight of her choice pressed heavier upon her. Middleton itself seemed complicit, the fog pressing against windows, the distant harbor, bells tolling like a dirge. She felt that the city, the orphanage, and now her own home were entwined in a silent judgment of her actions. By nightfall, Elizabeth understood that the moment of action had irrevocably changed everything. James, calm and observant, was no longer just a child. He was a presence that challenged her, a living reminder of the moral abyss into which she had stepped. The exhilaration of desire was now entwined with dread, and the fog-bound streets of Middleton seemed to whisper of consequences, yet unseen, of secrets that would not remain buried, of horrors yet to come. The fog that hung over Middleton had taken on a thicker, almost suffocating quality in the days following James's arrival at Elizabeth's house. The streets seemed narrower, the alleyways darker, and even the familiar clatter of the harbor echoed with an ominous resonance. Elizabeth walked through the city with a restless gait, the weight of her secret pressing upon her with increasing intensity. Each shadow seemed to whisper. Each passerby's glance carried suspicion she could feel in her bones. Middleton, she realized, was no longer a neutral witness. It had become a participant, a silent judge of her actions. At home, the presence of James was undeniable. He moved with the calm assurance of one who understands far more than he admits. Elizabeth observed him in small, everyday interactions, how he noticed the subtleties of the household, the unspoken hierarchies among servants, the hidden habits of her own son. Every glance he cast, every carefully measured gesture, seemed to carry a knowledge that unsettled her more deeply than she cared to admit. Her son, frail and timid, became a constant reminder of the choice she had made. Elizabeth watched them side by side and felt the sting of guilt pierce through the layers of ambition and desire that had driven her. Her conscience, which she had silenced with careful rationalizations, now whispered louder than ever. She began to see the consequences of her actions reflected in the children's eyes. Her son, bewildered and fragile, sensing a change he could not name. James, perceptive and silent, aware of the moral turbulence surrounding him. The first subtle signs of the unraveling appeared at the orphanage. A caretaker, quiet and meticulous, had begun to ask questions in gentle, probing ways. Small details did not align James's presence at unexpected times. Discrepancies in records, the unusual attentiveness of a new benefactor. Elizabeth felt the walls of her carefully constructed plan beginning to tremble. The fog outside pressed against her windows, as if mirroring her rising panic, and Middleton seemed to lean in, conspiratorial and oppressive, reminding her that secrets never remained hidden forever. One evening, Elizabeth discovered a letter tucked beneath the doormat, delivered without signature. Its contents were brief, yet suffused with menace. Some things that are taken cannot remain unclaimed. Be wary of the eyes that watch. Her pulse quickened, and a cold shiver traced her spine. The city outside seemed alive with portent. Lamps flickered in the fog, distant footsteps echoed with a regular rhythm, and the faint toll of a bell carried a dirge-like weight. James, as always, seemed unfazed. He moved through the house with his usual grace and attention, yet Elizabeth could not shake the sense that he perceived the growing tension. His eyes occasionally met hers, calm and assessing, as if silently questioning her choices. The realization that the boy could understand more than she intended filled her with both awe and terror. Middleton itself seemed to conspire with him, the city and its shadows reflecting the moral and psychological maze into which she had plunged. The household atmosphere grew increasingly strained. Servants whispered among themselves, noting subtle changes in the children, the unease that now lingered like a thick, invisible fog. Elizabeth found herself monitoring every gesture, every word, every movement. The simple act of feeding, dressing, or guiding James became a high-wire act of control and concealment. At night, the house felt alive with unseen presences, shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls, doors creaking as if in protest, and the soft, deliberate movements of James seeming almost like a dance of awareness and quiet authority. One evening, she confronted the reality she had tried to suppress. Alone in the parlor, she spoke to James, attempting to gauge his perception. "Do you understand," she asked softly, "that you are part of a family now?" James looked at her with an intensity that froze her words. "I understand," he said slowly, "but families are not only made of who lives together. They are made of what is true." His voice, calm and deliberate, carried a weight beyond his years. Elizabeth felt a cold dread settle into her chest. The boy was not just aware. He was judging, weighing, and reflecting back her own moral failing. Outside, Middleton's fog thickened into a near-solid curtain. The city seemed to hold its breath, its streets silent but charged with a latent energy that pressed against every window pane and doorframe. Elizabeth realized, with a growing terror, that the consequences of her actions were no longer abstract. They were imminent, tangible, and inescapable. The secret she had constructed so carefully was beginning to fracture, and with its fracture came an ever-deepening sense of horror, both moral and psychological. By the end of the chapter, Elizabeth was caught in the tightening web of her own ambition, her desires colliding with conscience and consequence. Middleton, the orphanage, and the children themselves were no longer passive elements of her life. They had become active participants in a narrative that was unraveling toward revelation and reckoning. The fog outside mirrored the fog in her mind, thick, suffocating, and pregnant with the inevitable truth that the house, the city, and even James could not be controlled indefinitely. The fog that had long enshrouded Middleton now seemed almost alive, curling through the streets like a suffocating presence. Elizabeth wandered her home in restless agitation, her mind a turbulent sea of fear, regret, and lingering desire. The secret she had nurtured, the audacious act that had brought James into her household, could no longer remain hidden. Every shadow, every creaking floorboard, Every subtle glance of a servant carried the weight of inevitable discovery. James moved through the house with his usual poise, his calm, assessing gaze never leaving her for long. Yet tonight, there was something different in his eyes, a quiet knowing, a depth that Elizabeth could no longer evade. He had observed her meticulously, sensed her anxieties, and now carried within him the unspoken judgment she had tried so desperately to escape. It began with a knock at the door, faint but deliberate. Elizabeth's heart seized. Outside stood the caretaker from the orphanage, her face pale, eyes sharp and wary. She stepped inside without waiting for invitation, the presence of authority carrying a quiet, inescapable power. "Mrs. Harrison," she said, voice calm but edged with steel. "We need to speak of James. There are inconsistencies that demand explanation." Elizabeth's pulse raced, a cold dread settling into her bones. She struggled to maintain composure, but the weight of her transgression pressed too heavily. Words faltered on her lips, and the carefully constructed facade began to crumble. James, sensing the tension, moved closer. His small hand brushed against Elizabeth's sleeve, not in fear, but with a deliberate assertion of presence. His gaze met hers, and in that moment, she realized the full depth of her miscalculation. This boy, so intelligent and aware, could not be manipulated as she had thought. The caretaker's questions unfolded with increasing precision. Documents were compared, recollections checked, and slowly, inexorably, the truth emerged. Elizabeth's heart pounded with each revelation. The moral and legal consequences she had evaded through careful planning were now inescapable. Middleton itself seemed to echo her inner panic, the fog pressing harder against windows, the distant bells tolling a dirge for her ambition and folly. Her son, the child she had tried to replace, watched silently from the hallway. His frailty had always been a source of disappointment, yet now he seemed a witness to the ruin Elizabeth had wrought, not only upon herself, but upon the lives of those she had sought to control. The contrast between the two children, once the source of her obsession, now became a mirror reflecting the full weight of her guilt. In the ensuing confrontation, Elizabeth was forced to confront the consequences of her desires. The caretaker, James, and her son were united, whether consciously or not, in exposing the moral collapse she had hidden behind her ambition. The house, usually a place of comfort and control, had transformed into a chamber of reckoning, where shadows seemed to twist and breathe, and every creaking floorboard was a voice of accusation. James, calm and perceptive, remained at the center of the storm. Though he spoke little, his presence alone conveyed the unyielding truth that deception, no matter how carefully wrought, leaves traces that even the most calculated mind cannot erase. Elizabeth's mind, once a landscape of plotting and desire, now reeled under the force of recognition. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. By nightfall, Middleton lay under a dense, suffocating fog, mirroring the moral darkness that had enveloped Elizabeth. The city, silent but watchful, seemed to witness her fall, its streets empty, yet full of latent judgment. The orphanage, the children, the shadows, they were all participants in the inevitable reckoning. Elizabeth sat alone in the parlor, the weight of her choices pressing down like a physical force. She understood, finally, that the pursuit of beauty and perfection at the expense of morality carried a price far greater than she had imagined. The house, filled with the quiet observation of those she had wronged, became a prison of her own making, and in that heavy, oppressive silence, Elizabeth faced the truth she had long denied, that ambition, desire, and vanity, when untempered by conscience, can transform life into a labyrinth of horror, from which there is no easy escape. Middleton, the city she had walked through with calculated confidence, now held her in judgment. The fog pressed against the windows, the distant bells tolled, and the shadows whispered of consequences, both real and eternal. The story of Elizabeth Harrison, her son, and James concluded not with triumph, but with the quiet, inexorable weight of revelation. The city, the orphanage, and the children remained as witnesses to the moral and psychological storm she had unleashed, a cautionary tale of desire, deception, and the terrible, inescapable reckoning that follows.